I couldn't stop thinking about their 50th anniversary, 50 years of my parents' lives, and I wanted to give them something unforgettable, something that screamed gratitude and love. I spent months searching for the perfect place, and when I stumbled upon that seaside mansion, I knew it was exactly what they deserved. Every detail mattered: the wide open terrace, the sparkling blue waves beyond the windows, the sun glinting off the polished floors. I imagined them stepping through the front door, eyes widening, hearts swelling with surprise. I wanted them to see not just a house, but the culmination of everything I had ever wanted to give them. I thought of my childhood, of the late nights I spent working odd jobs, of the sacrifices I made quietly while my siblings seemed to glide effortlessly through life. I wanted this to show them I cared in a way words never could. Yet, even as I packed the final boxes and polished the silver, a small knot of unease lingered. I remembered the way my mother always favored my older sister, praising her achievements while brushing mine aside. My father's compliments felt measured, almost reluctant, as if I had to earn each one. I pushed the thought aside, telling myself this gift would bridge whatever distance existed, that maybe, just this once, I could finally be seen as more than the overlooked child. I imagined the look on their faces, the smile that might finally warm the cold edges of their hearts. Everything felt perfect, meticulously planned, and yet, deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that the gesture might not be enough. Still, I carried that mixture of excitement and trepidation with me as I loaded the last of the boxes into the car, hoping, praying, that this moment would finally shift the balance of love and recognition in our family. I drove up the winding path to the mansion, my hands gripping the steering wheel a little too tightly, heart pounding with anticipation. The salty sea air filled my lungs, and I could see the sunlight glinting off the ocean beyond the wide terrace. I imagined their faces lighting up as they saw the house for the first time, their eyes reflecting in gratitude. But when I walked through the front door, my hopes collided with reality. My mother glanced at me briefly, barely lifting her eyebrows, and muttered, "It's nice, I guess," before returning to fuss over the curtains. My father's eyes met mine for a split second, and I could see a flicker of disappointment, subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough to make my stomach sink. And then there was my sister, smiling as if the mansion had been built just for her, basking in attention I thought would finally be mine. The room buzzed with celebration, but none of it was directed at me. I carried the boxes in quietly, forcing a smile. But inside, I felt the first sharp sting of betrayal. Every detail I had imagined, the hugs, the tears, the heartfelt thanks, was replaced with polite indifference and unspoken comparisons. My mother's dismissive tone, the way she lingered over every compliment she gave my sister, and my father's tight-lipped acknowledgement made me feel suddenly small, invisible, like all my efforts had evaporated before my eyes. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that perhaps they were tired, distracted, or overwhelmed. But a gnawing sense of inadequacy crept into my chest. Even as I unpacked a few personal touches, I had prepared flowers in the vase, photographs ranged perfectly on the mantel. I could feel their eyes pass over me without noticing. That heavy silence pressed down, and I realized, painfully, that the love I had hoped to see reflected in their faces was being withheld. It was my first real understanding that their favoritism ran deeper than I had ever admitted to myself, and that my gesture, no matter how grand, might not be enough to break through the walls they had built. As I stood in the grand foyer, watching my parents fuss over my sister, memories I had tried to bury surged forward. I remembered my 10th birthday, when my mother handed my sister the only present she seemed excited about and barely glanced at me as I tore open a modest gift. I had smiled politely, hiding the disappointment, while my sister squealed with delight. There were countless school recitals I attended, sitting in the back row while my parents whispered compliments to neighbors about my sister's performance, barely acknowledging that I had even participated. I remembered staying up late, saving my allowance to buy gifts for family members, while my efforts were met with a polite nod or a dismissive shrug. I recalled times when I had cried over small injustices or sought advice, only to be told I was too sensitive or overreacting. Those moments had planted a quiet seed of doubt in me, a persistent whisper that I would never measure up in their eyes. And yet, despite all of it, I had poured everything into today the mansion. The details, the thoughtfulness believing it might finally shift the balance. Standing there now, seeing their indifferent reactions, the contrast between my past sacrifices and my present generosity hit me with painful clarity. The mansion, the hours of planning, the financial and emotional investment I had made, it all seemed invisible to them. My heart ached, not just at their coldness, but at the realization that no matter how much I gave, they had already decided who was favored. It wasn't just a momentary slight. It was a pattern that had defined my entire life. And now it played out again in the room I had imagined would be filled with gratitude. That understanding made the sting of rejection sharper. But it also ignited a quiet determination inside me. If they would never see me as I truly was, I would find another way to ensure my worth couldn't be ignored. No matter how long it took, dinner had been ranged on the terrace, the sun dipping low, casting golden light over the sparkling waves. I thought perhaps, despite the morning's cold reception, tonight would be different. I had carefully planned the table, the menu, even a small toast to honor their 50 years together. But as soon as we sat down, my mother's eyes swept over me with that familiar, critical gaze. "So, still in that same job?" she asked, her tone sharp and incredulous, as if my career were a personal failure she couldn't understand. I swallowed hard, forcing a polite smile. "Yes, I'm happy with it," I said, but she wasn't satisfied. She glanced at my father, who nodded faintly, and continued, "You've never really contributed like your sister has. She's accomplished so much more in her life, truly impressive." The words hit me like cold waves, public and pointed, delivered in front of distant relatives who murmured agreement. I felt the warmth in my chest strain, replaced by embarrassment and disbelief. I had spent months preparing, sacrificing my time and money to honor them, and here I was, belittled and compared to the sibling who had always been favored. Every smile I had imagined, every expression of gratitude I had hoped for, dissolved into humiliation. My sister, glowing with approval, barely glanced at me, and I realized I was invisible to them, not just overlooked, but judged. Anger simmered beneath the surface, mingling with hurt and frustration. I had hoped generosity would heal old wounds, but instead it had exposed them, raw and bleeding. My fork trembled slightly as I set it down. The toast I had rehearsed in my head now caught in my throat. That evening, what should have been a celebration of family and milestones turned into a showcase of favoritism and dismissal. I left the table early, claiming a headache, and retreated into the quiet of the mansion, heart heavy but mind already calculating, wondering how I could turn this first public slight into something they would never forget. I shut the door behind me and leaned against it until my legs stopped shaking. The terrace lights dimmed, and the ocean sounded distant, like a radio playing far away. Inside, the house felt enormous and hollow. I sat on the edge of the guest bed and let the hurt settle around me, naming each sharp thing: embarrassment, anger, the old, familiar ache of being unseen. I kept replaying my mother's words, the way she had chosen humiliating praise for my sister over gratitude for what I'd done. Part of me wanted to storm back out and demand what any decent person would expect after gifting someone a house, at least a single honest thank you. Part of me wanted to cry until the sole on my cheeks matched the ocean outside. Instead, I breathed, hard and measured, because I had learned long ago that dramatic scenes fed into the narrative they liked, one where I was overly emotional, needy, forever the child to be pitied. Anger is a useful thing when it's honest. It shows you where to focus. Instead of letting it swallow me, I let it map the wound. I thought about every time I'd bent so far backward for them I'd nearly broken, the loans I'd covered, the favors I'd done, the nights I'd stayed up to comfort a parent who wouldn't remember my name in the morning. Those decisions had been mine and nobody else's. They had not come with the guarantee of thanks. Still, I had expected at least recognition. The lack of it felt like a verdict written long ago and read aloud now, in front of the people I wanted to matter. Sitting there in the quiet, I started to list facts, not feelings. Facts are steady. Feelings twist and bruise. Fact, I had bought them a house they could never have imagined. Fact, the deed and title were in my name until they signed the transfer details I'd kept private because this was supposed to be about surprise, not leverage. Fact, the mortgage was paid, but there were clauses, maintenance responsibilities, tax implications I knew more about than they did. Fact, my sister's achievements were more performative than substantive, and many of her accolades were built on opportunities I quietly facilitated years ago. Fact, I knew people who would testify to how much work I had put into their lives. Once I started cataloging, a plan began to form, not out of cruelty, but of necessity. If they wouldn't acknowledge me with gratitude, I could at least protect myself from further erasure. I pictured small, precise moves documenting conversations, quietly inviting a trusted friend who knew the family history to visit, tightening control over who had keys. I imagined subtle humiliations instead of explosive revenge, a public correction of a boast, a paper trail that revealed inconsistencies, a quiet legal reminder that generosity is not the same as ownership. None of it required the tricks. It required patience, consistency, and leaving traces that could not be gaslighted away. Anger softened into a cool resolve. I allowed myself a moment of grief, mourning not the house, but the version of family I had hoped for. Then I sat up, wiped my face, and began drafting the first steps. It would not be dramatic. It would be strategic. If the world saw my competence before my mother could gaslight it away, maybe I could rewrite my place in their story. I didn't want to destroy them only to correct the record. That was my promise to myself, whispered into the quiet as the waves kept their steady rhythm. I would gather evidence quietly, show competence where they expected none, let friends and neighbors bear witness to what I had done, carry myself with steady pride, and slowly, patiently, reclaim my name until no doubt remained. The next morning, I decided to immerse myself in the mansion, hoping that by showing initiative, they might finally acknowledge my effort. I offered to manage the cleaning schedule, organize the maintenance team, and even suggest improvements to the landscaping. I thought I could help streamline things, I said carefully, trying to keep my tone light, almost casual. My mother barely looked up from her coffee, waving a dismissive hand. "We have it under control," she said, as if my suggestions were nuisances rather than solutions. My father nodded, tight-lipped, giving a faint, almost imperceptible glance that carried more judgment than gratitude. My sister, perched in her favorite chair, smiled patronizingly, as if she had been born to manage this place without effort. Each small act I made to assert competence was ignored, dismissed, or subtly ridiculed. I pointed out a plumbing issue in the guest bath, carefully noting how it could escalate if neglected, but my concern was brushed off with, "We'll see about that." It felt like walking on a tightrope, every step measured, every word weighed, and yet no matter how carefully I moved, my authority was denied. The sting of invisibility grew sharper with each passing hour, mixed with the simmering anger I struggled to mask. And yet, beneath the frustration, a plan began to solidify. I realized that each dismissal was an opportunity to learn their weaknesses, to observe patterns, and to anticipate where they underestimated me. Every shrug, every smirk, every casual rebuff became a clue in a larger strategy forming quietly in my mind. The mansion, which I had hoped would be a symbol of generosity, was now a stage where I could test the boundaries of control, probe for openings, and gauge their vulnerabilities. What felt like rejection in the moment only fueled a growing determination. They were blind to my presence, blind to my competence, but I was taking notes, and every note would one day contribute to a reckoning they never saw coming. As the days passed, I began to realize that generosity alone wouldn't shift their perception. If they couldn't see my value, I would have to make it undeniable. I started by quietly reviewing the mansion's legal documents, something I had done months before purchasing it, but never mentioned. The deed was in my name until the transfer was formally completed, giving me control over how and when they could claim ownership. Tax benefits, maintenance clauses, even minor zoning regulations all were points I understood far better than they did. I subtly referenced them in conversations, never directly, but enough that a casual observer could sense a discrepancy between my competence and their ignorance. When my mother fussed over a contract clause she didn't understand, I casually explained it. Watching her hesitation, my father tried to interject, but I gently corrected him, keeping my tone calm and factual. Even my sister, who had always carried herself with the air of entitlement, seemed momentarily unsettled by my confidence. The mansion itself became a symbol. Every key I held, every document I understood, every decision I could make without hesitation emphasized a status they hadn't anticipated. Invitations I quietly extended to old colleagues and trusted friends further reinforced the subtle power shift. I knew they noticed the network I was quietly weaving around them. It was satisfying, in a restrained way, to see their glances flicker between doubt and curiosity, a shadow of FOMO creeping in. They were beginning to realize that the house I had gifted them was not just a gift, it was a stage where I quietly held the strings. Every smile I offered, every calm correction, every piece of knowledge displayed without fanfare, served as a reminder that the overlooked child was capable of control they had never imagined. The subtle tension hung in the air, invisible yet palpable, as I let them exist in a state of underestimated caution. By the time I retired to my room that evening, I felt a surge of quiet satisfaction. The mansion, once a simple gift, had become a chessboard, and I was already thinking 3 moves ahead. A few days later, I invited a handful of close friends and colleagues over, casual at first, under the guise of showing them the mansion's view. They arrived, marveling at the property, complimenting the design, and asking thoughtful questions about its purchase and management. I answered naturally, sharing insights without bragging, letting my competence speak louder than words. I noticed the subtle shift in my parents' demeanor immediately. My mother paused mid-sentence, eyes flicking between me and my guests, a trace of unease crossing her face. My father's jaw tightened, and he cleared his throat awkwardly when one of my friends casually referenced a business connection they had sought years ago. My sister smiled nervously, a faint flush on her cheeks, as if she were suddenly aware that the perfect family image she relied on was being quietly undermined. The air was charged, an unspoken acknowledgement that the child they had dismissed could hold influence they hadn't accounted for. Every compliment directed at me, every admiring glance from friends, felt like a small victory, a first taste of justice delivered subtly yet publicly. I kept my tone calm, letting the social proof do the work while they silently measured the difference between expectation and reality. It was a minor reversal, but one that sent waves through the household. My parents, who had always assumed control, now felt the tremor of being outshined. I could see it in their gestures, the way they hesitated to speak, the careful politeness that replaced their usual dismissal. That evening, as I walked past the terrace, hearing them murmur about the guests and my competence, I allowed myself a quiet, almost imperceptible smile. The mansion had transformed into a stage for subtle power shifts, and this small public acknowledgement was the first move in a game they were only beginning to understand. My patience was paying off, and I felt a surge of confidence knowing that my strategy was already planting seeds of doubt and respect, quietly bending their perception without confrontation, letting the world witness what they had long refused to see. The night of the formal celebration arrived, a gathering I had orchestrated with precision. Close family, friends, and a few influential acquaintances filled the terrace, the chandeliers casting warm light over the elegantly set tables. I had rehearsed my toast in my mind countless times, but I allowed it to flow naturally, letting the weight of the moment guide my words. I wanted to share something important tonight. I began, my voice steady, drawing the attention of every guest. This house, this gift, was meant to celebrate 50 years of my parents' life together, but it also comes with responsibilities they might not have fully understood. I paused, letting a subtle tension build, watching my mother shift uneasily in her seat, her eyes narrowing. The deed, the mortgage terms, and several clauses regarding upkeep and inheritance were all structured to ensure transparency and fairness. I continued. I wanted everything clear, so there would be no surprises, no misunderstandings. A few murmurs rippled through the guests as I casually mentioned how the property's financial and legal aspects were now fully compliant, perfectly documented, and under professional management details my parents had assumed they had mastered. My mother's smile faltered. My father's hand tightened on the stem of his glass. I could see the realization dawning, the slow creeping awareness that they had been overconfident, underprepared, and underestimated me once again. And I added, with deliberate calm, I've also ensured that any claims or disputes are fully protected, which means the house will remain secure regardless of family disagreements. The room fell silent. My sister, who had spent the last few days basking in approval, looked suddenly pale, her previous air of entitlement replaced with discomfort. Every guest's eyes flicked between us, sensing the subtle tension and the shift in authority. I watched my parents fumble, trying to maintain composure, to recover some semblance of control. But the truth was undeniable. The child they had dismissed, ignored, and belittled was quietly holding the power, and everyone in the room could see it. I let the silence stretch, long enough for the weight of my preparation and foresight to sink in, before moving on to casual conversation as if nothing had happened. But inside, I felt a thrill of satisfaction. The first major reversal had landed, and their public embarrassment was precise yet understated, exposing the truth they had hoped to conceal. The following week, I decided it was time for the final act, not a dramatic confrontation, but a demonstration they could neither ignore nor undermine. I invited several influential contacts, clients, and family friends to a casual brunch at the mansion. As my mother fussed over the table settings, I casually mentioned that I had arranged for the landscaping to be fully automated, cutting costs and enhancing the property's value. My father raised an eyebrow, clearly impressed despite himself. When my sister tried to insert a comment about her own accomplishments, I gently but firmly corrected a minor factual error regarding a business deal she had boasted about, letting the truth stand in a way that was impossible to dispute. The air shifted. My subtle displays of competence, combined with quiet authority over the mansion and its finances, forced them into a rare position. Acknowledgement. My mother's eyes flickered with unease, and finally she muttered, I didn't realize you handled all of this yourself. My sister, usually quick to claim superiority, swallowed nervously. Avoiding eye contact, I smiled politely, letting the words linger. I didn't need to raise my voice. The proof of my abilities, my independence, and my careful planning spoke louder than any confrontation. I watched as their assumptions unraveled in real time. Guests whispered among themselves, commenting on my foresight and skill, their admiration impossible to hide. The mansion, once a symbol of my generosity, had become a testament to my competence, my patience, and my quiet resilience. Every detail I had orchestrated the legal knowledge, the financial foresight, the carefully timed social displays had culminated in this moment where the favored child, long assumed to be naive and powerless, quietly commanded respect and admiration. My parents, confronted with undeniable evidence of my capabilities, were forced to recalibrate their understanding of me, recognizing mistakes they had made for decades. Inside, I felt a surge of satisfaction, tempered with the knowledge that this wasn't about revenge in the vulgar sense. It was about correcting a narrative, asserting my worth, and reclaiming the dignity that had always been mine. As the brunch continued, laughter and conversations flowing, I moved through the room with a quiet confidence, each interaction reinforcing my moral and social ascendancy. By the time the event concluded, the tension had shifted completely. The household, the family dynamic, even my sister's smug composure, all had to acknowledge that I was no longer invisible, no longer dismissed. In that moment, I felt the culmination of years of sacrifice patience, and strategy crystallize into something tangible: respect, recognition, and a subtle, satisfying justice that they could neither deny nor diminish. Later that evening, after the guests had left and the mansion had quieted, I wandered through the rooms, letting the soft hum of the ocean fill the spaces between my thoughts. I reflected on how the day had unfolded, the subtle acknowledgments, the quiet shifts in posture, the rare, hesitant compliments. A part of me felt light, almost buoyant, basking in the knowledge that I had reclaimed my voice and asserted my worth in a family that had long refused to see me. Yet beneath that satisfaction lingered a bittersweet ache. My parents remained flawed, their favoritism and emotional coldness woven into the fabric of their being, and no amount of strategy could fully erase years of neglect. I understood, with a twinge of melancholy, that this victory was not about changing them. It was about redefining myself within the story we shared. The mansion, once just a gift, had become a mirror reflecting my patience, intelligence, and resilience. I allowed myself a small, private smile as I realized I had accomplished what I had set out to do. I had demonstrated my competence, secured my autonomy, and, most importantly, shown that my contributions could not be ignored. Still, there was a quiet sadness that lingered in the corners of the house, an acknowledgement that while justice had been served, love and validation from those I had longed to impress remained imperfect. I sat by the terrace, watching the waves glinting in the moonlight, and let the complexity of the moment settle over me. Empowered, vindicated, yet aware of the imperfect humanity of my parents, I felt a profound mixture of pride and reflective melancholy. This balanced the satisfaction of standing tall while recognizing the limitations of familial affection was strangely comforting. I had proven my worth, not for them, but for myself, and in that knowledge, I finally felt complete. The next morning, I walked along the edge of the property, the sand cool beneath my feet, and the salty breeze carrying the sound of waves crashing gently against the shore. I looked back at the mansion one last time, the home I had gifted, the stage where long-held injustices had been quietly corrected. A sense of empowerment filled me, not the triumphant, boastful kind, but a steady, unwavering confidence that came from knowing I had acted with intelligence, patience, and dignity. My parents, my sister, the familiar patterns of favoritism and dismissal all remained behind those walls, but I no longer needed their validation to define my worth. Every step away from the house felt lighter, freer, as if I were shedding years of being underestimated, overlooked, and undervalued. I carried with me a sense of vindication, the satisfaction that my generosity had not gone unnoticed by those who mattered, and the quiet reassurance that justice, subtle but undeniable, had been served. In that moment, I allowed myself to feel the full arc of relief, pride, and emotional closure. The past years of sacrifices, ignored efforts, and painful comparisons remained part of me, but it no longer dictated my present or my future. I glanced back once more, a final acknowledgement of the house, the events, and the lessons it embodied, then turned fully toward the horizon. I walked forward, empowered and unshaken, carrying with me not only the satisfaction of karma realized, but also the freedom of having claimed my story, my worth, and my voice. The ocean stretched endlessly before me, reminding me that life moves forward, and so would I, stronger, wiser, and fully seen. Weeks later, a letter arrived at my apartment, unsigned, but unmistakably from my sister. I unfolded it carefully, heart racing with curiosity and apprehension. Inside, she admitted she had always been jealous of the attention and responsibility I quietly carried, that my competence and thoughtfulness had made her feel inadequate despite the praise she usually received. She confessed that witnessing the mansion and my calm handling of its affairs had finally made her recognize the imbalance she had ignored for years. There was no apology, no demand for forgiveness, just honesty and a subtle acknowledgement of my worth, something I had longed to hear. but never expected from her. I felt a rush of validation mixed with surprise. The final piece of my family's complex puzzle sliding into place. My parents, too, had made tentative overtures, asking for advice on investments and decisions they once handled alone. Their tone careful, respectful, almost hesitant. It wasn't perfect reconciliation, but it was recognition, and it lingered with a quiet tension. The family I had known remained flawed, yet now my place within it was undeniable. I smiled, folding the letter and setting it aside. I had reclaimed my narrative, witnessed subtle karmic justice, and even opened the door for acknowledgement from those who had long underestimated me. Yet, the story wasn't entirely resolved. It now carried a new, delicate complexity, leaving a trace of suspense that reminded me some wounds heal slowly, but power, patience, and integrity always leave their mark.